Hi, everyone. I'd like to welcome all of you for joining us for our fireside chat with Representative Hakeem Jeffries. I'm Kate Bahn. I'm the interim chief economist and director of labor market policy at the Washington Center for Equitable Growth. Before we get started, I have a few housekeeping notes. The event is on the record and is being recorded. All technical and logistical questions can go in the chat box, and there'll be no Q&A at the end. But of course, this conversation is just the start of what we hope is many such conversations and building a policy agenda for equitable growth. Today, our chat will be on how to build a just and competitive economy. This includes promoting policies that reverse hundreds of years of cumulative negative economic effects resulting from structural racism, such as addressing the criminalization of Black and Brown communities, to other economic phenomena like understanding how a competitive economy promoted through modern antitrust enforcement can result in growth that is broadly shared. And we also want to understand how these structural features are part of the same unequal economic system, so we know what policies we need to ameliorate inequality and rebuild a resilient economy. As we heard from our new president, Michelle Holder, in our opening remarks at the start of today, the Washington Center for Equitable Growth has changed the narrative on what makes the economy grow. The body of research we have built has demonstrated how equity fosters economic growth, and this framing was really able to meet the moment as we experienced the historic pandemic-induced recession. In the recovery, a dynamic and resilient economy is one in which all people have stability, security, and opportunity. Achieving this requires a sweeping policy agenda that promotes bold economic policy, as well as recognizing how other areas of policy influence economic outcomes. I can truly think of no one better to have this conversation than with Representative Hakeem Jeffries. Representative Jeffries represents the 8th Congressional District of New York, and he is serving his 5th term in the United States Congress. Among his many important roles in policymaking on Capitol Hill, Representative Jeffries is a member of the House Judiciary Committee and House Budget Committee, as well as the chairman of the House Democratic Caucus, having been elected to that position in November 2018. I'm excited to talk to him today because Representative Jeffries is a tireless advocate for social and economic justice. And Representative Jeffries' leadership is also near and dear to me. I'm a former resident of New York's 8th District, and I also started on this career path through working in the labor movement in New York City, where I worked at SEIU Local 32BJ, a property services union made up of hardworking New Yorkers across boroughs and racial and ethnic communities in the city. I'm so excited to welcome you, Representative Jeffries.
Great to be with you.
Great. So I want to sort of start with a really big overarching topic that came throughout our entire conference over the past 2 days. One of the big themes has been racial justice and the ways in which economic policy influences racial disparities in both obvious and less obvious ways. There's a really good line in our fireside chat with Kimberly Adams of Marketplace and Carlos Avenancio Leon, where he said the complexity of the system makes it hard to unmask the source of disparities. But I also know that you have a really clear understanding of how policy throughout history has either reinforced or alleviated racial disparities in economic outcomes. So, for example, one way this has happened throughout history is the implicit exclusion of Black Americans from many labor market protections, like the minimum wage provisions and the Fair Labor Standards Act, initially not covering industries that had an overrepresentation of Black workers. And there's research that Equitable Growth has funded by UC Berkeley economists Laura Darnancourt and Claire Montalou that has directly linked the expansion of minimum wage to previously uncovered industries to a reduction in the racial wage gap in the 1960s. So I want to understand, while I brought up a little of the research we funded, I know you are really well versed in sort of the myriad of ways this has occurred throughout history. How has your understanding of policies needed to alleviate structural racism been informed by economics research?
Well, thank you for that very important question. I think part of the challenge when you take a long-term view of the journey of African Americans in this country, and it's a great country, we've come a long way, but we still have a long way to go. And unfortunately, systemic racism has been in the soil of America for over 400 years, is that whenever there was an opportunity for there to be a transformational breakthrough moment, we always fell short. And so, for instance, after the initial emancipation of African Americans and the Reconstruction Amendments, the 13th Amendment prohibiting slavery pursuant to the Constitution, the 14th Amendment, equal protection under the law, the 15th Amendment guaranteeing theoretically the right to vote for African Americans. During that Reconstruction era, there was great hope, there was great promise, there was great opportunity. The establishment of the Freedmen's Bank, for instance, which was designed to provide resources and assistance in the newly freed slaves and being able to establish themselves in terms of businesses, labor participation, and home ownership, it all fell apart. And it was replaced by Jim Crow segregation, the rise of the Black codes, and an intentional effort to suppress the ability of African Americans to have the same level of opportunity as others throughout America. And that Jim Crow segregation lasted for almost 100 years. We had the Great Depression, of course, as you suggested, Kate, and some of the policy responses to that around the New Deal era, but African Americans were largely excluded from the programs that were developed throughout the New Deal, whether that's wage protections or whether that was through Social Security, excluding industries such as domestic workers and farm workers, where at the time African Americans were disproportionately overrepresented. We came back from the Great World War II, of course, and the United States, in its generosity, passed the GI Bill, creating opportunities, particularly for home ownership, for those members of the greatest generation who came home after liberating the world from Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany. And hundreds of thousands of African American World War II veterans were denied access, for instance, to the type of low interest loans and home ownership opportunities and employment opportunities that were provided to the veterans that they served with who were not African American. And then the Civil Rights era, of course, finally, and the Great Society was a substantial step forward in trying to even the playing field. But after several years, it was short-circuited by the election of Richard Nixon and then the rise of mass incarceration, which started in 1971, 50 years ago from where we are right now. At the time, there were less than 300,000 people incarcerated in America. Today, 2.3 million, disproportionately Black and Latino. More people incarcerated in America per capita than any other country in the world. Lives, families, communities have been ruined. So that entire journey of African Americans in this country has consistently involved missed opportunities and intentional efforts to deny the African American community the ability to participate on a level playing field.
Yeah, that was really helpful because I think sort of the journey you reviewed really demonstrates that racial disparities are, policy choices, particularly the continuation of racial disparities, have been intentional policy choices, which by the same token means that there's policy opportunities there to reverse them. And I think we're, optimistically on the precipice of another transformational breakthrough moment like the ones you've described in the past. We passed some of the most expansive relief and support measures last year that we've ever seen. And I think, we want to look forward to how to build exactly an economy that allows everyone to share in this and recognize that these disparities are choices. And so we need to make intentional policy choices to reverse them. And so I want to dig a little bit. I know you've done a lot of legislation around criminal justice. And one particular way that racial disparities have been maintained, as you described, is through mass incarceration and the over-policing of Black and Latinx communities. We have an essay on our website by the economist Robin Cox from the University of Southern California, where she describes how crime control was promoted through the expansion of criminal justice systems rather than through providing adequate social programs that would have alleviated social and economic inequality. So can you dig a little bit more into what are the ways that changes in criminal justice over time influenced economic outcomes and what impact this has had on the overall economy?
Well, thank you for the work that the Washington Center for Equitable Growth has done under Michelle's leadership with the wonderful team that has been put together in terms of some of the things that we've endeavored to do that you described here in Congress to respond to the once-in-a-century pandemic that we confront. We believe it needed and necessitated a once-in-a-century continuing, compassionate, comprehensive congressional response. Now, in terms of the impact of mass incarceration, and I'd say the failed war on drugs, where so many African Americans, as well as Latinos and poor whites, were viewed in part as economic commodities. Their criminalization with the standing up of a prison industrial complex and the rise of prisons in places where factories once were, or manufacturing plants, including back at home in upstate New York, where industry left, prisons were put up in their place. But once you build that prison, you want to fill that prison. And the way that those prisons were largely filled was with these draconian drug laws that we are only now working to reverse. Because thankfully, there's a bipartisan consensus now that overcriminalization in America has not yielded any public safety benefits, and it has dramatically undermined our capacity for full economic growth, particularly because of the devastating impact that it has had in breaking up families, in removing people from the labor force, both during their periods of incarceration, but also in their inability to successfully re-enter society upon being released because of the stigma that a criminal conviction traditionally has had in terms of job opportunities, as well as the ability to educate yourself. These are things that we now have begun to work on reversing with the First Step Act that passed in 2018 in a bipartisan way. We recognize that America benefits when someone has paid their debt to society. If those individuals can successfully re-enter society, become productive citizens, provide for their families, it creates a greater degree of safety in the community, and it saves taxpayer dollars at the same time. And so we are both unwinding the draconian drug laws that fueled our mass incarceration. I'm currently working on something called the Equal Act, which will finally eliminate what was once a 100-to-1 sentencing disparity between crack cocaine and powder cocaine, and is now 18-to-1, and we're going to make it 1-to-1, and also make it retroactive so that those who are still serving unjust sentences that Congress agrees are unjust can re-enter society. We have to unwind these draconian drug laws, but also make sure that we are investing in the communities that were hit the hardest by mass incarceration, in part through the Build Back Better Act, but in other ways that I think we need to be intentional in as we move forward.
Thanks. I think you sort of preempted what my next question too, which is, you're very thorough in your response. And so I want to know, like, the vision for the future, what will communities look like in this sort of new era of reformed criminal justice systems? Sort of what is your vision for that?
Thank you for that question. And I think the 1994 crime bill, which is now widely regarded as resulting in substantial overreach. And at the time, I think there were less than 1 million people incarcerated in America. It was toward the end of the crack cocaine epidemic, but $9 billion was authorized to incentivize states to build these prisons all over the country, while in exchange adopting punitive mandatory minimums, 3 strikes you're out laws, truth in sentencing, reducing judicial discretion. So Congress incentivized some pretty bad behavior in 1994 with the crime bill. And we went from under 1 million people incarcerated to 2.3 million in terms of where we are right now, when crime was going in the other direction. So these communities were devastated. And I think my vision is that we have to reverse engineer the damage that Congress did. Because what you often hear in the First Step Act was reform at the federal level, and that was necessary to take that step. But we know that the majority of people incarcerated in this country come from communities and are incarcerated at the state level, not the federal level. Now, some would suggest, well, that's the state's job to deal with the dynamics of overcriminalization in America. My response is, Congress in 1994 incentivized bad behavior by authorizing and incentivizing $9 billion in prison construction in exchange for adopting these punitive laws. And so we have an obligation to undo the damage that was done in those communities by investing in job opportunities for the 21st century economy, entrepreneurship, home ownership. A large part, and the Center for Equitable Growth has done some great work in this regard. We know that the racial wealth gap can in large measure be explained by the low home ownership rates of African American families relative to white Americans and almost every other ethnic group. And so being intentional about what has always been the path for one generation to pass some modicum of wealth to the next generation here in America, being intentional about making sure that we can promote home ownership in traditionally disadvantaged communities, I think will be part of that forward-looking vision to reverse engineer a lot of the damage that has been done.
Yeah, that was great. And I think it's a really good example of how some policies that are generally considered outside economic policy have these huge economic impacts. And so we really need to recognize the link between these two areas of policy. I've done some research on looking at how, for example, like wealth inequality, as you've described, has an impact on competition in the labor market. And so if workers don't have personal wealth because they maybe have not had access to home ownership, or they have huge amounts of student debt, it is much harder for them to search for a good job for themselves, because they can't sort of, take a break between jobs to find the best fit for them, or they have more upper mobility. They're sort of living paycheck to paycheck perhaps, and it really backs them into a corner and makes the labor market much less competitive than it would be otherwise. And so it's like an interesting link that maybe is not recognized, that some of these measures of social inequality are also inputs to economic inequality, and in turn give companies a lot of power to be able to exploit both workers, consumers, sort of all sorts of different people.
Thanks for pointing out that link. And if I could just mention one quick statistic, and this relates to your first question about systematic racism and the legacy of discrimination that has occurred. The Federal Housing Agency that was stood up in the aftermath of the Great Depression as part of New Deal era policies between 1934 and 1962, I think it was something like 98% of the loans that it issued as part of its mission to promote home ownership, low interest loans, went to white Americans. That's almost impossible to do unless it's intentional discrimination. And then you layer on top of that the discrimination that related to the GI Bill. And we're still dealing with the legacy of those dynamics and its adverse impact on the labor market to this very day. So I appreciate you raising that link.
Yeah. And sort of extending on this topic of competition, but in a little bit of a different direction, corporate power has also played a really important role in shaping the economic inequality. And one particular way this has played out in recent years has been the explosion of big tech companies, particularly those who develop platforms and networks that disproportionately shape our society, our politics, and our economy. And there was a really great quote at an earlier session today by Ryan Garrity for United for Respect, where she, took a topic like tech companies, which may seem sort of, outside what might be under the jurisdiction of policymaking, but she brought the point that workers should have power in workplaces, and the collective we should have power in the economy because business practices affect society broadly. It's also a fight about democracy, and we have to take power on multiple fronts. I know in the House Judiciary Committee, there's an anti-monopoly agenda that has been put forth that really hones in on these big tech platforms that are shaping so much of our society and our economy. So for our last question, I know we're running out of time. Can you talk through the growing consensus about the risks that big tech represents for the economy and how this agenda that you're a part of will expand on the enforcement powers of antitrust authorities?
Well, the innovation economy is incredibly important to, America winning the future. And we recognize that dynamic, but we also recognize that we need a functioning market, not a market which currently exists where a handful of big technology companies dominate to the exclusion of others, both in terms of suffocating out the possibility that new innovators, new entrepreneurs, new startups can grow and develop. And when you have these sort of monopoly-like companies in terms of their dominance and the intense concentration of power, it dramatically limits consumer choice and ultimately has adverse consequences either on privacy, on our democracy, as we've seen, and in many instances in terms of pricing. And competition within the workforce. And so, we are going to embark on giving, for instance, the Federal Trade Commission new enforcement authority so that they can block successfully the mergers and acquisitions that we've seen, for instance, Facebook being allowed to acquire WhatsApp and Instagram, which there is no circumstance where that should have been allowed to occur. But the FTC did not have the ability under the law to functionally block it. We want to change that landscape.
Great. That was a great note to end on. And I just also sort of want to tie the two things together, that both the policy sort of agendas that you talked about today have been bipartisan efforts, which I think is also really hopeful looking for the future, that you've been a big part of these bipartisan efforts that we think will have huge impacts on addressing economic inequality and broadly inequality across society. So thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for your leadership on these different policy areas.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Kate. And thank you, Chair Jeffries, for that stimulating conversation. I think it's the perfect note on which to conclude this year's conference. I'm David Mitchell, Equitable Growth Director of Government and External Relations, and it's my honor to close us out today. Before I do, I want to underscore a few takeaways, a few themes that I noticed over the course of the conference. First, is the growing consensus, both in the academic and policy communities that we heard from today, that the old way of doing business, of trusting markets to solve all problems, has failed. As Equitable Growth's new president and CEO, Michelle Holder, made clear in her fireside chat with Lisa Cook yesterday, and again in her opening remarks earlier today, after 4 decades of economic policy that prioritized tax cuts, deregulation, and reduced public investment, we today face overlapping racial, climate, and care crises. So not a winning track record. The second theme is that the coronavirus pandemic and recession have both exposed the country's economic fragilities for all to see, the racially stratified labor market, the lack of worker protections, the immense power of the wealthy, and at the same time demonstrated the indispensable role that government does and can play in the economy. The importance of functioning public health, labor enforcement, and tax collection regime, for example. And we heard this during Labor Secretary Walsh's remarks yesterday, which stressed the way workers, especially women of color, have been forced during the pandemic to risk their safety to make a living, or just be pushed out of the workforce altogether. And finally, third, we now have a once-in-a-generation opportunity, a phrase that I heard more than once over the proceedings to reform our public institutions so that they help deliver strong, stable, and broad-based economic growth. That means rooting out structural racism in the criminal justice system, as we just heard about from Congressman Jeffries, and in the tax code, something Carlos Avendaño León also shed light on earlier today. And it means rejecting austerity and making long overdue public investments in care infrastructure and climate mitigation, as multiple panelists have discussed. We've also heard how academic evidence can help point the way towards this stronger economic future, whether it's replacing the old, disproven economic theories still being used by judges in antitrust cases against big tech, or reassessing the relationships between debt, inflation, and growth in light of rising inequality, or simply calculating the economic benefits we all receive when working mothers have stable childcare and when Black, Latinx, and Indigenous workers can fully participate in the economy. We at the Washington Center for Equitable Growth, and that includes now more than 300 academic researchers across the country we work with, are doing all we can to help build this evidence base. And we look forward to collaborating with all of you as part of that long-term mission. So with that, I would like to thank all of our speakers for sharing their wisdom and passion these last 2 days. Thanks to all of you in the audience for taking the time out of your busy schedules to engage in this important conversation. Thank you to Equitable Growth's incredible staff for producing such a successful event. There are too many to name, but I will give special shout outs to my colleagues, Natalie and Tandi, Elena Waski, Kate Bahn, Mariam Janani Flores, Adrian Narayan, and our event production company, Solomon Productions. The networking lounge is open for another 2 hours, so if ideas are still percolating or you want to meet more of your fellow participants, we can't provide virtual drinks, but we can provide a virtual chat room, and we hope to see you there. I know many of my Equitable Growth colleagues will be in attendance. Last but not least, a few plugs for upcoming events. Next week on September 29th, Michelle Holder will be speaking at a virtual Hamilton Project event we're very excited about on resilience after recession, the emerging landscape for American workers and families. We work very closely with the Hamilton Project on a number of programs, and we think very highly of their work, so I hope to see you there. And the week after that, on October 6th and 7th, Equitable Growth is proud to join with the Groundwork Collaborative and other partner organizations to host EconCon. The theme this year is building an economy that works for all of us, and the very impressive agenda and speaker list can be found at econcon.com. We hope you can join.